G'day, this is Chris Savage from RL Ministries in Australia, welcoming you to this session of the Book of Isaiah. This is a study that has been taken from Dr. Arnold Fruchtenbaum's commentary on the Book of Isaiah. Dr. Fruchtenbaum is the founder of RL Ministries. Thank you for coming along. So here we are, we're into session 29. We're going to get through this evening from 53:1 down to 54 verse 3. Let's go. Last session we just remember we saw the suffering servant. He came back into the scene again. Chapter 52 verses 13 to 15. God reintroduced him back then because he was back in chapter 49. It appeared that he was a failure. Remember that? But now we see that he's going to prosper and succeed in his mission. He's going to be exalted. He's going to rise, referring to his resurrection. He'll also be lifted up, referring to his ascension. So this suffering servant will one day, well, he has in the past, he has now risen and is exalted. He's gone. He should be very high, which means he's going to sit at the right hand of God the Father, which is his present session in heaven. And his exaltation is in very sharp contrast with his humiliation as a suffering servant. For his body was, remember, his body was so marred more than anyone else ever in all of humanity. And this was a disfigurement caused by his scourging he received, followed by his crucifixion. Now, remember, when people looked upon the cross in the closing hours of Messiah's life, all they saw was just a writhing, fleshly form that no longer resembled a human being. He was so badly beaten and marred. Consequently, many would be appalled by him. But he has the victory for nations, and kings will be astonished by his victory. And they'll be startled, absolutely startled, at how high an estate this servant has reached. Kings are going to shut their mouths at him, showing their respect for this exalted servant. For there will come a time when they'll all finally understand what Messiah has endured and what he has done. Right, we're going to continue with this servant. Here we go. Now, Isaiah says, who has believed our message? We're into chapter 53, verses 1 to 3. Who has believed our message? And to whom has the arm of Jehovah been revealed? For he grew up before him as a tender plant, and as a root out of a dry ground. He has no form nor comeliness, and when we see him, there's no beauty that we should desire him. He was despised, rejected of men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief, and as one from whom men hide their face, he was despised, and we esteemed him not. Now, the question here is being asked, who has believed our message? This is in verses 1 and 3. In verse 1 is Israel's unbelief. Who had believed our message? The word message here means hearing. Who had believed our hearing? Who had believed what we have heard? Remember, Israel for a long time heard the report of the suffering servant. Even today, every time a Jew is witnessed to, he hears the report of the suffering servant. However, for most of the Jews who hear of this suffering servant, they do not believe. And from the biblical text, it is clear that this is going to continue right until the tribulation. And the faithful remnant in verse 1 is asking, who had believed our hearing? They heard, but they did not believe. And now, also in second part of verse 1, they ask, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? Isaiah is going to expand in detail who this arm will be. Now, remember, well, I'm reminding you, in 4 earlier sessions, he spoke of this arm and that those who trusted in it will be saved. What is this arm all about, or who is he? Well, according to Isaiah 51:5 and 9 and 52:10, the arm belongs to God and brings forth justice. It is a personality, or he is a personality. The arm of Jehovah is not God the Father, but God the Son. And by means of his humiliation and suffering, he will bring about the salvation of Israel without money and without price. Now, verse 1 here in 53 is quoted in John 12, verses 37 to 38, and also in Romans 10:16. And this chapter actually is quoted very heavily in the New Testament. Verse 2 brings out the humanity of the servant. For he grew up before him as a tender plant and as a root out of a dry ground. Hebrew word here for tender means a young plant. It's a sapling or it's a sucking branch. We would call it a sucker. So this sucker sucks nourishment from the plant and prevents the rest of the tree from growing and producing fruit. Eventually, it will kill the plant. So what does a gardener do? Well, a gardener comes along and he removes the sucking branch. And that's why people generally go through their veggie gardens and tear off the sucking branch, because it sucks life from the plant. And that's how Israel considered this servant, this person. They viewed the servant as a sucking branch to be broken off and thrown away. And this refers to his lowly origins, his humanity in his first coming. He was viewed as a suckling to be broken off and thrown aside. Not only would he be viewed as a sucking branch, but he'd also be considered as a root out of dry ground. What does that mean? Well, it means that such a root cannot produce. It's worthless and will be stepped on and crushed into the ground. If we go back to Isaiah 11:1, Isaiah 11:1, remember Isaiah 11:1, it says, "There shall come forth a shoot out of the stock of Jesse, and a branch out of his roots shall bear fruit." Wow, that's exactly what he's talking about here. We covered that verse earlier on. Remember, this verse emphasizes the humanity of Christ by connecting him with Jesse rather than with David in his entire kingly splendor. So what we see here is the emphasis in this passage is not upon David, but upon Jesse. Jesse, he was the lowly shepherd. He was a poor branch of the family. The Messiah, being the root of Jesse, does not emphasize his royalty, but it emphasizes his simple humanity. And the emphasis is that when the Messiah comes, the glorious house of David will be reduced to nothing but a stump. So in his humanity, Messiah would come out of the stock of Jesse the shepherd, and his first coming would emphasize not his royalty, but his humanity. Also in verse 2, second part of verse 2, it says he has no form or comeliness. Now, what does that mean? It means that when the Jewish people would see him, there'd be no beauty that they should desire him. He would not be characterized by physical beauty, and nothing about his outward features would actually draw people to him. And this goes contrary to most of the pictures we have of Christ. Every picture of Jesus is a figment of someone's imagination, and all it does, it ends up being idolatry more than anything else. I mean, you've seen those where it's a Scandinavian-looking, long blonde hair with blue eyes, fair skin. Well, that's not what Jesus looks like. In fact, there's nothing about him we would desire. Verse 3 predicts the reaction of the people to the servant, and it now adds some detail to the description of his sufferings. He was despised and rejected of men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. Okay, how was he despised? Well, he was despised in several ways. First of all, it says he was despised and rejected of men. Now, of the different Hebrew words for men in this passage, this one is Ishim, I-S-H-I-M, Ishim, which means a man of rank. Ishim means a man of rank. So he was despised by the leaders of Israel. And that became very evident in the Gospels. It was the Pharisees, who were the leaders of Israel, who led the nation in the rejection of their Messiah in Matthew chapter 12. Now, having described the reaction of the people to the suffering servant, the verse goes on to prophesy that Messiah would also be a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. The word sorrows here in Hebrew, makavot could be better translated as pains. A man of pains. And grief in Hebrew is koli, better translated as sickness. So he was a man who was acquainted with pain and sickness. And throughout his ministry, that is what he was involved with as he went about relieving the pain and the healing the diseases. And this is what the Gospels show us. And we see this in Matthew 4:24 and 8:1-3, and also in Luke chapter 4, verse 40. And as it says, and as one whom men hide their face, he was despised, and we esteemed him not. So he was so intimately acquainted with human frailty that he would be someone from whom men hide their faces. And in verse 2, we're told that men were not attracted to him by his physical looks. Verse 3 adds a thought to this. Men were not only not attracted to him, but they were actually repulsed by him. It says they hid their faces from him. And we see this in the Gospels quite often. People were repulsed by what he had to say and by his strict demands and ethics. The verse repeats the fact that the suffering servant would now be despised. So he not only would he be despised, but it says we, Isaiah's people, the Jewish people, we would also not esteem him. In Jewish circles, that's still true today. We call him Yeshua in Hebrew, but the majority of Israel do not hold Jesus in very high esteem at all. In fact, an expression of this sentiment is seen in the name that the rabbis gave to the Messiah. They call him Yeshu, Y-E-S-H-U. In Hebrew, this name is an acronym for the epithet Yemak Shmo Vezikrono, meaning, may his name and memory be blotted out. That's what they call the suffering servant today, Yeshu. So in Israel, you'll not hear his proper name of Yeshua. You'll hear Yeshu. Another name was Ha-Talui, meaning the hanged one. And throughout the Talmud, he's referred to as the Talui, which means the hanged one. Now, he's also referred to in the Talmud passages as Yeshu ben Pandera. Now, what's this? Well, this name is also spelled Pantera or Panthera or Pandira. It refers to, this is what the Talmud speaks about him. It refers to Yeshua, Jesus, suffering servant, as the illegitimate son of Miriam or Mary and a Roman soldier named Pantera. Ben means son of, but what does Pandera sound like? Pandera. Remember, this is a Greek time frame. Rabbis may have thought of the Greek mythological figure called Pandora. Remember Pandora? Remember all the evils of the world were said to have come out of Pandora's box. And since the rabbis considered Yeshua to be the source of much evil and saw him as a magician or having connection with magical practices, this designation may have seemed quite fitting. Isaiah was right when he said, we esteemed him not. Truly, Israel esteemed him not. Still don't. Now, the Greek word for gospel, right? The Greek word for gospel is euangelion. Euangelion, in Jewish writings, they have a bit of a word play upon that. They've made up a similar sounding phrase, which in Hebrew is evangelion. However, evangelion does not mean gospel. It means the scroll of sin. Now, what does that mean? It means that they consider the writings of the apostles to be evangelion rather than euangelion, scrolls of sin. They consider the Gospels to be scrolls of sin. So in every respect, the prophecies of verse 3 have been fulfilled. Since Isaiah 53, 1-9 will be Israel's national confession before the second coming of Messiah, they'll also admit that they esteemed him not. So in verses 1-3, we see the second stanza. Now, moving on, third stanza third stanza or strophe, you might see strophe, is in verses 4-6. And this has to do with the fact that he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. Here we go. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. Yet we did esteem him stricken, smitten of God and afflicted. But he was wounded for our transgressions. He was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement of our peace was upon him, and with his stripes we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned every one to his own way, and Jehovah has laid on him the iniquity of us all. The fact that surely he had borne our griefs and carried our sorrows is this theme. This is the theme here. And in verse 4 is his substitutionary sufferings. Now, Israel recognizes when they make this confession that his sufferings were on behalf of Israel. Remember, this is their national confession. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. They recognize that his suffering was substitutionary. He took upon himself their sickness and their pain. Again, Hebrew word or Hebrew terms for grief and sorrow mean sickness and pain. Hebrew word for has borne is a word called nasa, N-A-S-A, meaning to lift or to carry or to take, which in the book of Leviticus chapter 16, verse 22, always has the sense of offering a sacrifice. So Israel begins to recognize that when he was bearing their suffering, it was in the sense of offering up a sacrifice. And they begin to recognize that when he bore their pain and sin, it was in the sense of offering a sacrifice. Yet we did esteem him stricken, smitten of God, and afflicted. So as far as Israel's attitude, when the suffering servant was suffering, he deserved that suffering. They thought he suffered for his own sins. They believed he was smitten by God and that he received the just punishment from God. The word stricken is a Hebrew word, nagah, means to touch or to reach or to strike. It's a term used when a person comes down with a loathsome disease such as leprosy. And the emphasis of the verb is on the affliction. It's used back in Genesis 12:17. Genesis 12:17. What happens back then? God struck plagues upon the house of Pharaoh. Also we see it in 1 Samuel 6:9 and 1 Kings 19:5. There's some other examples there. Hebrew term for afflicted, ana, means to be bowed down from suffering, means to be bent over and bowed down. Israel thought that the servant deserved to be harshly stricken, smitten, and afflicted by God. That's what they thought. And as far as they were concerned, he was justly punished by God for his own sins and had suffered and had suffering and death coming to him. He deserved it. He deserved to die according to the Jews. And this verse is quoted in Matthew 8:17. Matthew 8:17. Another reference that the rabbis invented for Yeshua is the term ha-pashia. Ha-pashia meaning the transgressor or the sinner. Now, as far as the Talmud was concerned, Jesus died because he was a transgressor. Rambam, remember Rambam or Moses Maimonides? He said in about the year 1172, he said that Jesus deserved this type of violent death. He was simply expressing the very attitude portrayed of Israel in verse 4. We did esteem him stricken, smitten of God, and afflicted for his personal wrongdoings. And this verse, as I said, is quoted in Matthew 8:17. Verse 4 dealt with his substitutionary sufferings. Now verse 5 deals with his substitutionary death. Now Isaiah makes 4 points here. First of all, he says, he was wounded for our transgressions. So what's he saying? Well, his death was substitutionary. The word wounded, kalal, C-H-A-L-A-L, means to be pierced through. Hebrew here means piercing was involved. Not just a slight flesh wound, not just a nick. Kalal refers to one who was actually pierced right through, either with a stave or a sword or a spear, which is exactly what happened to Jesus. Second, he was bruised for our iniquities. Now, Hebrew word here for bruise is dakar, which means to crush. Jesus was thoroughly crushed, especially through the scourging that he received. And the reason for this punishment was why? It was for Israel's iniquities. It was all for Israel's iniquities. And third thing we see in verse 5, see, third part of verse 5, the chastisement of our peace was upon him. What's the point here? Well, the point here is that the punishment which leads to peace was placed upon the servant. Now the Hebrew term for peace here is shalom. Shalom refers to the spiritual peace of those who believe. So his suffering was necessary to bring about spiritual peace for those who will believe. The punishment that leads to this type of peace was placed upon this suffering servant. The servant's undeserved suffering on behalf of sinners results now in their well-being. They now have peace. Fourth thing we see with the servant's stripes, Israel would be healed. With his stripes we are healed. Hebrew term for stripes is chavura, refers to welts and swellings of the skin due to beatings or flogging. So Israel's healing would be affected by the servant's suffering. The servant's suffering releases them from their agony. It proves to be redemptive in scope. Everything the servant would endure was in payment for the transgressions of others, and it affected or effected their healing and well-being. Verse 6 is Israel's condition. Isaiah writes, all we like sheep have gone astray. We've turned everyone to his own way, and Jehovah has laid on him the iniquity of us all. Once again, we have the element of substitution. As far as Israel is concerned, they have gone astray. Isaiah is speaking and he says, we and us, we like sheep have turned everyone to his own way. Us, we and us, referring to the Jewish people. We Jews have gone astray. We each have gone our way, but the guilt of our transgression was placed upon the servant of Jehovah. He received the punishment that we should have received. Indeed, all but the servant have strayed far from God's way, but instead of punishing them, Jehovah requested the payment for sin from the innocent servant. And this verse is quoted in 1 Peter 2, 21 and 25. 1 Peter 2, 21 and 25. Peter wrote this epistle to fellow Jewish believers, and he stated here, I'll read it for you. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 21 and 25. For hereunto were you called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example that you should follow his steps, who did no sin, neither was guile found in his mouth, who when he was reviled not again. When he suffered, threatened not, but committed himself to him that judges righteously, who his own self bare our sins in his body upon the tree, that we, having died unto sins, might live unto righteousness, by whose stripes you were healed. For you were going astray like sheep, but are now returned unto the shepherd and bishop of your souls. Background of these verses in 1 Peter 2, 21 and 25 is clearly Isaiah 53, verse 6. Verses 7 to 9 now encompasses the fourth strophe or stanza of Isaiah's servant song. He was oppressed and afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. Here we go. 7. He was oppressed, yet when he was afflicted, he opened not his mouth. As a lamb that is led to the slaughter, and as a sheep that before its shearers is dumb, so he opened not his mouth. By oppression and judgment he was taken away. And as for his generation, who among them considered that he was cut off out of the land of the living for the transgression of my people, to whom the stroke was due? And they made his grave, verse 9, and they made his grave with the wicked, and with a rich man in his death, although he had done no violence, neither was any deceit in his mouth. Okay. Verse 7 emphasizes the silence of the servant. In spite of his oppression and affliction, he experienced it all in silence. He was oppressed, yet when he was afflicted, he opened not his mouth. He would neither defend himself nor protest. He just kept silent. As second part of verse 7 shows, not only would he not open his mouth in his affliction, but he would be like a sheep that is silent when it is sheared, and like a lamb led to the slaughter without bleating. As a lamb that is led to the slaughter, and as a sheep that before its shearers is dumb. So he opened not his mouth. He said nothing. This verse is quoted in Acts chapter 8, verse 32. However, the fulfillment of this verse is mentioned by all four gospel writers. All four gospel writers point out that at both his civil and religious trials, he suffered injustice in silence. The four writers who mention this are Matthew 26, 62 to 63, all there on your screen. Matthew 27, 12 to 14. Mark 14, 60 to 61, and 15, 3 to 5. Luke also in Luke 23, 8 to 9, and John 19, 10. All four gospel writers emphasize the fact that when he suffered, he did so in total silence. Isaiah proclaimed a prophecy regarding Messiah's behavior during his sufferings and trials. He next dealt with the trial itself, and then he covered the subsequent execution of the servant. Verse 8 deals with the trial and death of the servant. Several points we need to look at here. First of all, by oppression and judgment, he was taken away. Okay. Hebrew word for oppression also means restraint and coercion and may be rendered as prison. Hebrew term for judgment, mishpat, refers to a judicial judgment, meaning the act of deciding a case in a trial and a litigation before judges. Now, while none of the Gospels specifically mention Yeshua being held in a jail or a prison, 3 of them record that he was brought, captured, and bound to the praetorium of the governor. And that we find in Matthew 27 and Mark 15 and John 18. So while the Gospels may not explicitly state that Messiah was jailed, they record that he was held captive and treated as a prisoner. Again, those passages, Matthew 27 and John 18 especially. Between his arrest and his trial, there was a period of several hours during which Messiah had to have been held somewhere, and that would have been in a jail. And after being flogged, he went through the process of a judicial trial before being led away to the place of execution. Now, as for his generation, who among them considered? Well, the great emphasis of the Gospel of Matthew is the failure of Christ's generation to recognize who he was. However, that failure of his generation to recognize Jesus was already prophesied by Isaiah. As for that generation, who among them considered? Well, the word considered here means thoughtful consideration. Is that in the next one? Nope. Thoughtful consideration. Just lost it. Okay. Who among his generation gave thoughtful consideration to the fact that he was the Messiah? His generation would not even talk or care about what happened. And then we see that he was cut off out of the land of the living. That is his death. The expression "you shall be cut off" was used over and over again in the Mosaic law. Repeatedly, it was emphasized that violation of the Mosaic law meant they'd be cut off or killed. And you see it there in those passages in Exodus and Leviticus. Exodus 31:14-15 and Leviticus 23:29-30. This same expression is used here. The Messiah died a penal sacrifice. Messiah suffered the penal judgment of the law. It was not that he was guilty of breaking the law, but it says, for the transgression of my people to whom the stroke was due. And the word transgression here always means the violation of a specific law or specific laws. So the servant was cut off, not for any violation on his part, but for a specific violation of the Mosaic law by Isaiah's people, by my people, Israel, who deserved to be cut off. Messiah took the penal judgment of the Mosaic law upon himself so that Israel would not have to die. And that is the reason that the nation of Israel will be saved. The Messiah took upon himself the curse of the law. He became a curse for the sake of his people to whom the stroke was due. The stroke of the sword should have fallen upon Israel, but by way of substitution it fell upon the suffering servant Messiah himself. And this is quoted in Acts 8:33. In 1 Corinthians 15:1-4, Paul spelled out 3 things that one must believe to be saved. First point being that Messiah died for our sins. So this statement here agrees, the statement in 1 Corinthians 15:1-4 agrees with this verse here in Isaiah. He died. He died for the sins. Now, having dealt now with the patient suffering of the servant in verse 7, and with his substitutionary death in verse 8, Isaiah next covered the servant's burial in verse 9. And they made his grave with the wicked and with a rich man in his death. Although he had done no violence, neither was any deceit in his mouth. Now, the first 2 lines would be contradictory without New Testament revelation. 2 points. First, they made his grave with the wicked. And second, it says he was buried in a rich man's tomb. These are contradictory statements, unless we understand what actually happened. Now, a person who died as a criminal on the Jewish law could not be buried in the family plot. He had to be buried in a special criminal's graveyard. Now, since Jesus died as a criminal, crucifixion was a criminal's death. So he would have been naturally assigned a criminal's grave. But Isaiah says that although they will assign him a criminal's burial, he will end up being buried in a rich man's tomb. And the fulfillment of this is found in Matthew 27, verse 57 to 60, and Mark 15, 42 to 46, along with Luke 23, 50 to 54, and John 19, 38 to 42. All of these passages say that a rich man named Joseph of Arimathea requested the body and obtained it. Jesus was buried in a rich man's tomb and not in the criminal's grave to which he was originally assigned by the Roman and Jewish leaders of the day. And again, this fulfilled Isaiah's prophecy. Two other statements in verse 9. First of all, it says he had done no violence. Now, this means that he was not guilty of any outward sin. And second, he had no deceit in his mouth. This means that he had no inner sin. So even though the suffering servant will be assigned a criminal's grave, God will arrange it so that he will end up being buried in a rich man's tomb. Why? Well, that is because he was not guilty of any outward or inward sin. The penal penalty that he paid was substitutionary. He was not guilty of any particular sin. And this verse is the content of the second thing that one has to believe in order to be saved, as 1 Corinthians 15, 1 to 4 shows. The second point is that Messiah was buried, which was the real evidence of his death. Now, Israel's national confession ends with verse 9. Next is the theology of the suffering servant explaining the meaning of verses 1 to 9. Here we go, verses 10 to 12. It says, this now encompasses the fifth stanza or the fifth strophe of Isaiah's servant's song. It says, yet it pleased Jehovah to bruise him, he had put him to grief. That's 53, 10 to 12. Yet it pleased Jehovah to bruise him, he has put him to grief. When you shall make his soul an offering for sin, he shall see his seed, he shall prolong his days, and the pleasure of Jehovah shall prosper in his hand. He shall see of the travail of his soul, and shall be satisfied. By the knowledge of himself shall my righteous servant justify many, and he shall bear their iniquities. Therefore, verse 12, therefore will I divide him a portion with the great, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong, because he poured out his soul unto death, and was numbered with the transgressors. Yet he bare the sin of many, and made intercession for the transgressors. Okay, now, verse 10 states that his death was an offering for sin. Although in verses 1 to 9 he seemed to be suffering at the hands of men, verse 10 states who was actually in control. God the Father was pleased to bruise the servant, and the Hebrew term for pleased here means he was delight. It means to delight in bruising him, to delight. It was God's specific will to bruise, or more literally, to crush the servant. The Father put him to grief. The word put to grief means to be weak or sick, to become ill, or to make sick. So God put the servant to grief, meaning he diseased him. Same term was used back in verse 4. Now this is very strange. Why was God pleased to do such a thing? Well, Isaiah explained that it was in order to make his soul an offering for sin. Hebrew word for an offering for sin here is asham, which means offense or guilt. It refers to a trespass offering. And that is the most important offering of the Hebrew Bible. Check it out in Leviticus 5:14 to 7. Leviticus 5, verse 14 to 6, verse 7. 5:14 to 6:7. God made this servant a trespass offering, showing that the servant died for both unintentional and deliberate sins. So why did he have to die? He died to become an offering for sin. And because he became an offering for sin by means of his death, there's another seeming contradiction in the third part of verse 10. It says, he shall see his seed. Now, how can he see his seed if he dies and is buried? Well, we have the answer in the fourth part of verse 10. He shall prolong his days. How can his days be prolonged if he dies? The only way possible is by means of resurrection. So the servant's seed are those who will benefit from his death. They'll benefit by spiritual rebirth. And the moment they accept for themselves his substitutionary death for their sins, they're born again spiritually by the Holy Spirit. And by this spiritual rebirth, they now become the servant's seed. And because he has been resurrected, he sees his seed. He sees the ones who come to him by faith. That also means he shall prolong his days beyond his death, because it comes by means of resurrection. According to 1 Corinthians 15, 1-4, the third thing one must believe in order to be saved is that the Messiah was resurrected. Here it is here. In addition, in the fifth part of verse 10, the pleasure of Jehovah shall prosper in his hand. So the suffering servant was not a failure at all. His death was not a failure. It was a tremendous success because it accomplishes the very purpose that God had intended. In spite of the plotting of Satan, in spite of the schemes of the Jewish leaders, in spite of the deviousness of the Roman leaders, in spite of all the conniving in the spiritual and physical realms, this was still God's will that was accomplished. It was God's success that is seen in all that the servant experienced. And verse 10 is the offering of the servant as a sin sacrifice. And what was that result? Well, let's look at it. The result in verse 11 is justification. He shall see of the travail of his soul and shall be satisfied. He shall see the travail of his soul and be satisfied. Now, God is going to be satisfied by the death of the servant. And that is what the word propitiation means. God has wrath against sin. That's the point of Romans chapters 1-3. God's wrath is revealed against all sin and all unrighteousness. God's wrath must be appeased. Propitiation means that God's wrath has been appeased. How is it appeased? It's appeased by verse 11. He shall be satisfied by the death of his son. The death of his son will appease God's wrath against sin, because the death of his son is the payment of sin, according to verse 10. Therefore, God's wrath will be appeased or satisfied by the death of his servant. And the servant's sin offering of his own blood will be accepted by God. From the early days of Genesis, God was willing to accept animal blood. Once the Messianic servant dies as a sham sacrifice, as a trespass offering, that will make the final blood sacrifice, and no other sacrifice will be acceptable after that. No animals, no other sacrifice at all, other than the blood of Christ, is now acceptable to God. And the result of the propitiation, it says, by the knowledge of himself shall my righteous servant justify many, and he shall bear their iniquities. Now, some translations have by the knowledge of himself. A better translation is by the knowledge of him. So, how are men justified? By knowledge of the suffering servant. Two Hebrew words for knowledge. One means experiential knowledge. The other means intellectual knowledge, head knowledge. The word used here means experiential knowledge. So, by experiential knowledge of him, God's suffering servant, people are going to be justified. There are two Hebrew words for knowledge. One is head knowledge, other is experiential knowledge. Word used is experiential knowledge here. So by the experiential knowledge of him, the servant, the people will be justified. When we accept Jesus as our Messiah, as our Savior, when we say we accept this substitutionary death on our behalf for our sin, when we accept what Jesus did in his sufferings and death on our behalf, then that is when we enter into the experience of it with him. That is how we come to know him experientially. So it is by this experiential knowledge of him that we are justified, which means we are declared righteous because our Savior is righteous, and his righteousness has now been placed upon us or on our account. So Justification will come to those who have experiential knowledge of this servant, because verse 11 says, he shall bear their iniquities. In verse 12, the servant is going to be rewarded. The word therefore is always significant. Let's always discover what it is there for. Because of everything the servant did in verses 1 to 11, because he suffered vicariously for sinners, among whom he was counted and for whom he died, he would be greatly rewarded. God would give him a portion with the great. He will divide the spoil and divide the portion. Now, when in the Messianic kingdom, when Jesus returns at the end of the tribulation, he is going to inherit the entire world. He will inherit it, and he will rule over the kingdoms of men during the Messianic age. However, does he rule alone? No, not at all. He is going to co-rule with the church saints and with the tribulation saints. If you don't believe me, check it out in Revelation chapter 20, verses 4 to 6. Revelation 20, verses 4 to 6. Therefore, with these other saints, the great and the strong, he will divide the rulership in the kingdom. He will possess all the kingdom, but he will co-reign with him. We will co-reign with him. We're part of his seed. Because we're a part of his seed, we are heirs with him. We enjoy the kingdom promises, the kingdom blessings, and even more so, kingdom authority. Messiah will divide the rulership of the earth among these saints. Because he poured out his soul unto death, because he was numbered with the transgressors, because he bare the sin of many, because he made intercession for the transgressors. The passage now ends, second part of verse 12, with a statement regarding Messiah's present ministry. It says, and made intercession for the transgressors. Messiah has and is interceding for the saints today. Verse 12 is quoted in part in Luke 22:37. However, the great burden of this chapter has been to give us the reason why the Messiah will suffer. Now, the fact that he was going to suffer, Isaiah has spelled out on several occasions. However, he had not yet provided a reason. Now he finally gives us the reason why the Messiah was suffering. 52:13 to 53:12. He's going to suffer by way of substitution. 9 times in this passage is the concept of substitutionary sacrifice and death. I'm going to list these through now. First up in verse 5, he was wounded for our transgressions. Second, verse 5, he is bruised for our iniquities. Third, in verse 5, chastisement of our peace was upon him. Verse 5, with his stripes we are healed. Verse 6, the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. And then verse 8, as for his generation, who among them considered that he was cut off out of the land of the living for the transgression of my people, to whom the stroke was due? And in verse 10, when you shall make his soul an offering for sin, verse 11, he shall bear their iniquities, and verse 12, yet he bore the sin of many. 9 times we see the concept of substitution given in this chapter. 9 times it was said that he died for sin. However, he'll not die for his own sins, but for the sins of Israel. The day is coming when Israel as a nation will make this great confession. That is when Israel as a nation will come to its national regeneration that will lead to its restoration. This is one of the most important chapters in the Old Testament, Isaiah 53, 1 to 12. Now, moving into Isaiah 54, we see the restoration of the wife of Jehovah here in verses 1 to 17. Now, when it comes to a separate systematic study of Israelology, the study of Israel, one of the sections of that study is the relationship between Jehovah and Israel as the wife of Jehovah, in contrasting with the church as the bride of Christ. Okay, 2 different things. Now, I'm going to give you the relationship here between Israel and Jehovah, where Israel functions as the wife of Jehovah. Stage 1, we see the marriage contract, Deuteronomy 5, 1 to 3 and Ezekiel 16, 8. When the contract is made at that stage, the groom and the bride enter into the marriage union. We saw earlier on that this marriage contract was the book of Deuteronomy. The book of Deuteronomy must not be looked upon merely as a repetition of so many laws which already come into existence. What was it? It's God's marriage contract. Deuteronomy is God's marriage contract with Israel, and it contains all the facets and features of the ancient marriage contract. After the initial marriage contract, which was made at Mount Sinai, Israel went through a second stage where she committed great acts of adultery. The stage 2, great adultery, Jeremiah 3:1-5. Israel turned away from God in order to play the part of a prostitute despite God's manifold blessings to her. So she became guilty of spiritual adultery. And so Israel failed to keep her promise to remain faithful to Jehovah, to whom she committed herself in the original marriage contract. Stage 3, we have the separation. We see that in Isaiah 50 verse 1. Separation, this is the next stage. Separation took place between Israel and God. This separation lasted about 100 years. Context is Isaiah 50 is that many Israelites complained that since God was withholding the material blessings promised in the book of Deuteronomy, he had divorced his wife. However, that wasn't so, as we've seen. In Isaiah 50, the Lord said that he had not divorced his wife. This was evidenced by the fact that there was no bill of divorcement. The material benefits had been withheld because of Israel's adultery. And the material benefits of Deuteronomy were only guaranteed on the conditions of faithfulness, and Israel was unfaithful. Stage 4, the divorce, we see it in Jeremiah 3, 6-10. So even after the 100 years of separation, which we found from Isaiah 50, during which the blessings of Deuteronomy continued to be withheld, Israel still failed to return to God or her husband. And so God finally issued the bill of divorcement. In stage 5, we have the punishment in Ezekiel 16:35-43. Original marriage contract between Israel and Jehovah, the book of Deuteronomy, clearly declared that if Israel proved adulterous, it would become necessary for God to punish his wife for her unfaithfulness. So following the issue of the bill of divorcement comes a long period of punishment of Israel for her sins. To this day, Israel is still in the 5th stage of her historical and prophetic relationship with God. She is still in a period of punishment. And the persecution of the Jews around the world and the present worldwide dispersion prove this point. Stage 6, the remarriage. Jeremiah 31:31-34. Ezekiel 16:60-63. Someday there's going to be a remarriage between Israel and Jehovah, and a new marriage union will be entered into. Only this will be based upon the new covenant, whereas the original contract was based upon the Mosaic covenant. Israel will remain faithful to God and will enter into a state of perpetual security and blessing. In Isaiah 54 is a discussion of the 6th stage. The 6th stage will come when there's a national regeneration of Israel. This national regeneration will take place during the last 3 days of the tribulation. And this will mean that the enjoyment of a marriage agreement between Israel and Jehovah. All of its benefits will be experienced during the Messianic kingdom. So chapter 54 has for its point the 6th stage of this particular marriage relationship. Here we go. We're going to see the return to the land in chapter 54, verses 1-3. In verse 1, there's a call to rejoice. Sing, O barren, you that did not bear. Break forth into singing and cry aloud, you that did not travail with child. For more are the children of the desolate than the children of the married wife, says Jehovah. This is a gradual upward call here. Several steps. First of all, sing. Second, break forth into singing. Third, cry aloud. Reason for this rejoicing is that the past problems will be obliterated in favor of future blessings. These past problems were that during her adultery, separation and divorce, Israel has produced more children than during the time of her marriage. All of these children were and are illegitimate, and for that reason, the land has become desolate. However, there's going to be a change in the conditions in verse 2. Enlarge the place of your tent and let them stretch forth the curtains of your habitations. Spare not. Lengthen your cords and strengthen your stakes. God says to Israel, enlarge the place of your tent. Well, the place where Israel's tent is located is to be enlarged. Even the tent itself is to become larger, since the place where it is to be erected has become larger. Israel will have to stretch out the curtains of this tent and use longer ropes. It says, lengthen your cords, strengthen your stakes. Make your tent pegs more firm. Why? Because it's going to be bigger. The point in this verse is this, that the land that Israel is about to possess is going to be enlarged. Never in all of Jewish history has Israel ever possessed and inhabited all of the promised land. However, when this remarriage takes place and God and Israel are reunited, for the first time Israel will possess all the land promised to the patriarchs. The land will be enlarged, so the tents must be enlarged also. And then we see the return to the, why do they need larger tents since they'll expand their territory? Well, the answer is given in verse 3. In verse 3, for you shall spread abroad on the right hand and on the left, and your seed shall possess the nations and make the desolate cities to be inhabited. So what is he saying here? Well, he's saying Israel is going to spread out to the east and the west because she'll produce far more children in her faithfulness than she ever produced in her adultery. And the second part of the verse repeats what was said back in Isaiah 26:15. Isaiah 26:15. Also, we see here that the seed of Israel will possess these other nations who are outside her borders, and she's also going to rebuild the cities which are inside the land. So the land will be inhabited and the people within it will be enlarged because her offspring will be more numerous than ever before. And with this enlarged and hugely populated Israel, we're going to leave it for this session. Thank you for coming along. Study hard, grow strong.